Welcome to the debunking of the grand solar minimum fable, particularly the idea that a multi-peaked solar cycle predicts an upcoming grand solar minimum. I have often asked those who are propagating the idea of a grand solar minimum, what is the best indicator that we are about to enter a grand solar minimum? One of the answers I often get is that previous cycles have more than one peak. So let's test this hypothesis with a little bit of simple data analysis. And one wonders why the proponents of this particular idea haven't done the same thing and shown that it is complete and utter nonsense. The data that we're going to use is from the Solar Influence Data Center in Belgium, where it lists the sunspot number. I have a link to that particular website here, so you could go and look at the data yourself and do your own analysis if you wish to do so. I will look at the last 10 cycles. If you looked at all 24 cycles, you get exactly the same results. And so I'm going to ask the questions of each cycle. How many peaks do cycles typically have? What proportion of cycles have double or multiple peaks? And how many of those cycles are followed by a grand solar minimum? Let's start with the simple case of solar cycle 15. It clearly has only one major peak. Solar cycle 16 is more complicated. It is a long flat-topped cycle which could consider have one peak or up to 4 peaks. Solar cycle 17 has one major peak and possibly a second one. You see there's a very large spike late in 1938 which could be considered a second peak. Solar cycle 18 is another complicated case. It certainly has 1 or 2 peaks, but then there are lots of little minor peaks following, so it could have anything from 2 to 5 peaks. Solar cycle 19 is relatively simple. It seems to have one peak. Solar cycle 20 seems to have 2 peaks, one leading peak and then a small one late in the cycle, but there may be a second peak in that first burst. So that's 2 to 3 peaks. Solar cycle 21 has 2 peaks. Solar cycle 22 also has 2, as does solar cycle 23, and as does solar cycle 24. So let's summarize the results of all of those cycles. You can see that I listed the number of cycles down the left-hand side from 15 to 24, the number of peaks that we seem to think were in each, and whether it was followed by a grand solar minimum. And none of these were followed by a grand solar minimum. So we have a wide variety of cycle shapes, and none of them seem to be indicative of a grand solar cycle. So what is the answer to our question? Our first question was, how many peaks do cycles typically have? And the answer ranges from about 1.8 to 2.4, basically on average about 2 peaks. What proportion of the cycles have double or multiple peaks? And that's 80% of them. So they're not an exception and can in no way be considered a harbinger of something yet to come, because most of them are like that. How many multi-peak cycles are followed by a grand solar minimum? As we've had no grand solar minimum for 400 years, then the answer to that is 0. So what conclusions can we draw from all of this? Most cycles have multiple peaks. Double or multiple peak cycles are not a harbinger of upcoming grand solar minima. So forecasting an imminent grand solar minimum based on the multiple peak hypothesis are almost certainly wrong. So that's it for today. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay safe and goodbye.